Katherine Walsh's champagne glass slipped from her manicured fingers. Crystal shattered against marble, the sound cutting through wedding chatter like a blade. Her face went white as she stared at me standing behind the serving station, hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a borrowed apron over my bridesmaid dress. 5 words tumbled from her lips, loud enough for the head table to hear. The room tilted. Conversations died. My sister Samantha's perfect smile cracked like porcelain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 hours earlier, I stood in the bridal suite at Willowbrook Country Club, watching my sister transform into the bride she had always dreamed of being. Samantha's wedding dress cascaded around her like spun moonlight, each pearl and crystal catching the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows. Grace Coleman, her maid of honor, fussed with the cathedral train while Isabella Torres, the venue's wedding coordinator, checked her clipboard with military precision. I adjusted the delicate lace sleeves on my burgundy bridesmaid dress, the fabric smooth against my skin. The irony wasn't lost on me that this dress cost more than most people's monthly salary, yet here I was, supposedly the family disappointment. At least that's what our parents had been telling Samantha for years. "Victoria, can you help with the catering situation?" Isabella appeared at my elbow, her voice tight with barely concealed panic. "We're short-staffed in the kitchen. 2 servers called in sick this morning, and we have 300 guests arriving in an hour." Before I could respond, Samantha whirled around, her face flushed with bridal stress. "Victoria can handle it. She's used to that kind of work anyway." Her words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of discomfort among the other bridesmaids. Grace shifted uncomfortably while the younger bridesmaids suddenly found their phones fascinating. "That kind of work." I let the phrase settle in my chest, feeling the familiar ache of family assumptions. For 5 years, I had been building Meridian Tech Industries from a startup idea into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I had led teams through impossible deadlines, negotiated with Fortune 500 executives, and spoken at conferences where my words moved markets. But to my family, I was still Victoria who dropped out of law school, Victoria who disappointed Dad's political aspirations, Victoria who chose the unpredictable path of technology over the safe harbor of traditional careers. "Sam, I'm your sister, not hired help," I said quietly, hoping to avoid a scene on her wedding day. "I'm supposed to be in your wedding party." Mother appeared behind her like a shadow, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early morning chaos. Margaret Hayes had mastered the art of looking regal even in crisis. "Victoria, dear, you know how important this day is for Samantha. Surely you can put family first for once instead of whatever little business ventures you're involved with these days." Little business ventures. I almost laughed. Last month, Meridian Tech had been featured on the cover of Forbes as one of the fastest-growing companies in America. The article had called me a visionary, a game-changer in artificial intelligence and sustainable technology. But my mother still spoke about my work like it was a phase I'd eventually outgrow, like my teenage obsession with photography or my brief stint learning violin. The truth was more complicated than they knew. I had been purposely vague about the extent of Meridian's success. The Hayes family had never been comfortable with wealth that came from anything other than inherited money or prestigious professional careers. Dad's law firm represented old Colorado money, the kind that came with expectations and social obligations. Mom's charity work moved in circles where new money was tolerated but never quite accepted. My tech fortune felt different, somehow less legitimate in their eyes. "Please, Victoria," Samantha's voice cracked slightly. "Dylan's family is already here. His mother keeps making comments about our family's hospitality. I need everything to be perfect." Tears gathered in her eyes, threatening to ruin the makeup artist's careful work. I looked around the room at faces I had known my entire life. Grace avoiding my eyes. Isabella checking her watch with increasing anxiety. Mother's expectant stare. And Samantha, my little sister who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, now looking at me like I was her last hope for social salvation. The weight of family obligation pressed down on me like a physical thing. In the boardroom, I commanded respect through competence and vision. Here, I was still the family member who could be counted on to solve problems quietly, without fuss, without recognition. The one who would sacrifice her own comfort for the greater family good. Fine, I said, setting down my bridesmaid bouquet on the vanity. But I'm not missing the ceremony. Relief flooded Samantha's features. Thank you, Vic. I owe you one. But even as she said it, I could see her mind already moving to the next crisis, the next detail that needed managing. I was a problem solved, not a sister making a sacrifice. Isabella led me through the country club's elegant corridors, past oil paintings of long-dead industrialists and display cases filled with golf trophies. The kitchen buzzed with controlled chaos. Lucas Grant, the head catering manager, looked up from a towering wedding cake with relief written across his face. You're a lifesaver, he said, handing me an apron. We need someone on the appetizer station during cocktail hour. Just smile, serve, and try to look invisible. Rich people like their help to blend into the background. I tied the apron over my bridesmaid dress, the burgundy silk disappearing beneath white cotton. In the polished surface of a serving tray, my reflection looked foreign. Hair pulled back efficiently, makeup still perfect from the morning's preparation, but something in my posture had shifted. I stood straighter in boardrooms than I did in my own family's presence. The cocktail hour began with the gentle hum of conversation and clinking glasses. I stationed myself behind the hors d'oeuvres table, watching Cedar Falls elite society mingle on the garden terrace. Women in designer dresses air-kissed while their husbands discussed golf handicaps and market fluctuations. This was the world my family desperately wanted to belong to, the world where appearances mattered more than authenticity. I recognized several faces from charity galas and country club events. Mrs. Davidson from the Historical Society. Judge Morrison, who had presided over several of Dad's more prominent cases. The mayor's wife, still wearing her signature pearls despite the casual outdoor setting. They moved through the crowd with the confidence of people who had never questioned their place in the world. Excuse me, could I get some of those bacon-wrapped scallops? A tall man in an expensive suit approached my station. Nathan Pierce, if I remembered correctly. He owned several hotels downtown and had been trying to get his daughter into the same prep school Samantha and I had attended. I arranged the appetizers on a small plate, my movements practiced from years of hosting corporate events where attention to detail mattered. Would you like the herb aioli on the side? I asked, keeping my voice neutral and professional. He nodded absently, already scanning the crowd for more important conversations. I was invisible to him, just another member of the service staff ensuring his comfort. The irony stung. 6 months ago, Nathan had pitched me a business proposal for incorporating smart technology into his hotel chain. He had sat across from me in Meridian's glass conference room, wearing his best suit and most ingratiating smile, trying to secure a contract worth millions. Now he looked through me like I was made of air. More guests approached my station throughout the hour. I served and smiled and tried not to think about the irony of my situation. Many of these people knew me professionally, had sought partnerships with my company, had attended galas where I was the guest speaker. But here, reduced to borrowed apron and serving duties, I might as well have been a stranger. The ceremony began as the sun started its descent toward the mountains. I managed to slip away from the kitchen long enough to watch Samantha walk down the aisle, radiant in her chosen happiness. Dad beamed with pride as he gave her away to Dylan Reed, a pleasant man whose family owned a chain of successful car dealerships. They were a good match, both coming from families where success was measured in reputation and social standing rather than personal achievement. I stood at the back of the assembled guests, still wearing my apron over the bridesmaid dress, feeling like an outsider looking in on my own family's joy. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, I clapped along with everyone else, but part of me felt hollow. This should have been my moment as her sister, standing beside her as she promised her life to another person. Instead, I watched from the sidelines, relegated to the support staff. The reception began immediately after the ceremony, guests flowing from the garden terrace into the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables dressed in cream linens and burgundy roses. The band began playing soft jazz as people found their seats, champagne glasses already filled and waiting. I returned to my post in the kitchen, helping coordinate the dinner service. Course after course flowed from kitchen to dining room, a carefully choreographed dance of servers and plates and wine pairings. I caught glimpses of the reception through the serving doors. Samantha and Dylan's first dance, elegant and rehearsed. Dad's toast, full of pride and carefully chosen words about family and tradition. Mom wiping tears with her monogrammed handkerchief. It was during the dessert course that everything changed. Katherine Walsh, Dylan's boss from the marketing firm where he worked, had been enjoying herself thoroughly throughout the evening. She was a sophisticated woman in her 50s, known throughout the industry for her sharp mind and sharper tongue. I had heard Dylan mention her several times during family dinners, always with a mixture of respect and mild fear. Katherine approached my station as I was arranging the final dessert plates. The wedding cake had been cut and distributed, but we were also serving individual chocolate soufflés with raspberry coulis, an elegant touch Isabella had insisted upon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I kept my head down, focused on the careful placement of each dessert component. These look divine, Katherine said, reaching for one of the plates. The presentation is restaurant quality. There was something in her voice, a note of appreciation that made me look up briefly. Our eyes met for just a moment before I ducked my head again, focusing on drizzling the raspberry coulis with artistic precision. But in that moment, something shifted in Katherine's expression. Recognition flickered across her features like a candle being lit in a dark room. Her champagne glass, which had been halfway to her lips, began to tremble in her manicured hand. I watched in slow motion as understanding dawned on her face. The realization of who I was, what I represented, and the impossible situation she was witnessing. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers, crystal meeting marble with a sound that would echo through my memory forever. The crash silenced the nearby conversations. Heads turned toward our corner of the ballroom. And then Katherine Walsh, respected industry executive and Dylan's intimidating boss, spoke 5 words that would unravel everything my family thought they knew about me. Victoria Hayes, CEO of Meridian? The words hung in the air like smoke, visible and undeniable. Around us, the wedding reception continued for a heartbeat longer before the implications began to ripple outward like circles on a disturbed pond. Someone at the head table had heard. Then someone else. Whispered questions began to spread through the gathered guests like wildfire. I straightened slowly, meeting Katherine's shocked gaze with the composure I had learned in countless board meetings. The serving apron suddenly felt like a costume I was wearing in someone else's play. Around us, the careful social order of my sister's wedding reception began to shift and crack, revealing truths that had been hidden beneath layers of family assumption and willful ignorance. This was the moment everything changed. The moment when the daughter who had been serving appetizers revealed herself to be the woman who commanded boardrooms and moved millions with a single decision. And in that revelation lay the seeds of a reckoning that had been years in the making. Katherine Walsh stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on mine while champagne dripped from her fingers onto the marble floor. The recognition in her face was absolute now, no longer a flicker of uncertainty but the blazing certainty of someone who had just witnessed the impossible. "You're Victoria Hayes," she said again, her voice carrying across the ballroom with startling clarity. The Victoria Hayes who revolutionized sustainable AI integration. The woman who turned down Microsoft's acquisition offer last year. My throat felt dry as sandpaper. Around us, conversations had begun to die away as more guests became aware of the commotion. I could see Nathan Pierce turning in our direction, his expression shifting from polite interest to confused recognition. Judge Morrison set down his wine glass and leaned forward in his chair, straining to hear what was happening. "I think there's been some confusion," I said quietly, hoping to contain the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. But Katherine was already shaking her head, her professional instincts taking over despite the shock. "No confusion at all," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I attended your keynote at the Denver Tech Summit 6 months ago. You spoke about ethical AI development and sustainable business practices. Your presentation changed how our entire firm approaches client technology integration." She gestured at my apron with bewildered hands. What are you doing serving food at a wedding? The question hung in the air like an accusation. From across the ballroom, I could see Dad rising from his seat at the head table, his politician's instinct sensing a developing situation that needed management. Mom's face had gone pale as she tried to process what she was hearing. Samantha looked confused and increasingly panicked, her perfect wedding reception beginning to unravel before her eyes. "This is my sister's wedding," I said simply, as if that explained everything. But even as I said the words, I realized how inadequate they sounded. How could I explain to Katherine Walsh, successful executive and industry leader, that my own family had relegated me to kitchen duty on one of the most important days of their lives? Catherine's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching horror. "Your family doesn't know, do they?" Her voice dropped to a whisper, but in the sudden quiet of the ballroom, her words carried clearly. "They have no idea who you really are." Before I could answer, Dylan appeared at Catherine's side, his face flushed with the combination of wedding joy and champagne. "Ms. Walsh, I hope you're enjoying yourself. Have you met my new sister-in-law Victoria? She's been helping out with the catering tonight." His tone was cheerful and unconsciously condescending, the way people speak when they're proud of a family member's willingness to pitch in with manual labor. Katherine turned to look at Dylan with an expression of pure disbelief. "You mean to tell me that Victoria Hayes, the CEO who built a company worth $3.7 billion, has been serving appetizers at your wedding?" The number hit the ballroom like a physical blow. $3.7 billion. I watched as the figure registered on face after face throughout the crowd. Mrs. Davidson's hand flew to her pearls. Nathan Pierce's mouth fell open in shock. Judge Morrison stood up completely, abandoning all pretense of polite disinterest. Dylan's smile wavered and died. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some mistake. Victoria works in computers or something, but she's not. I mean, she's not." He trailed off, looking between Katherine and me with growing confusion. "She's the founder and CEO of Meridian Tech Industries," Katherine said with crisp authority. "One of the fastest-growing technology companies in the world. She's been featured on the cover of Forbes, Time, and Business Week. She testified before Congress last year about AI regulation. Each fact landed like a hammer blow. And you had her serving hors d'oeuvres." The silence that followed was deafening. 300 guests seemed to hold their breath collectively, processing the impossible revelation that the woman they'd been ignoring in the catering station was worth more than most of them could imagine. The cognitive dissonance was visible on their faces as they tried to reconcile the serving apron with the staggering wealth Katherine had just described. Dad reached our corner of the ballroom first, his lawyer's training helping him navigate crisis situations with practiced composure. "I think there's been some confusion here," he said smoothly, extending his hand toward Katherine. "I'm Robert Hayes, Victoria's father. Perhaps we could discuss this misunderstanding privately." Katherine looked at his outstretched hand but didn't take it. "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Hayes. Your daughter is one of the most successful entrepreneurs of her generation. I've been following her work for years." She turned back to me, her expression mixing admiration with profound confusion. "The question is why she's been hiding it from her own family." More people were gathering now, drawn by the spectacle of raised voices and obvious tension. I could see Samantha pushing through the crowd, her wedding dress making navigation difficult, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. Grace followed close behind, along with several other bridesmaids who looked like they were watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. "Victoria," Dad said, his voice carrying the warning tone I remembered from childhood. "Perhaps you should return to the kitchen and let us handle this situation." The dismissal was automatic, instinctive. Even faced with evidence of my success, his first impulse was to send me away so the adults could clean up the mess. It was such a perfect encapsulation of our family dynamic that I almost laughed. Instead, I reached behind my back and untied the apron strings. The white cotton fell to the floor, revealing my burgundy bridesmaid dress underneath. Without the apron, I stood straighter, my posture shifting back to the confident bearing I wore in boardrooms and conference halls. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, like watching someone step out of a shadow into clear light. "Actually, Dad, I think it's time we all handled this situation together, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned to wield in hostile negotiations and tense investor meetings. Katherine smiled approvingly. Now that's the Victoria Hayes I remember from the tech summit. She turned to address the growing crowd around us. Ladies and gentlemen, you're witnessing something remarkable. This woman has built one of the most innovative companies in America from scratch. Her work in sustainable technology has revolutionized how businesses think about environmental responsibility and artificial intelligence. I watched my family's faces as Katherine continued her impromptu introduction. Mom's expressions cycled through confusion, disbelief, and what might have been the first stirrings of understanding. Dad's politician mask was slipping, revealing genuine shock beneath the practiced composure. Samantha looked like she was going to be sick. But the most remarkable thing, Katherine continued, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her subject, isn't just her business success. It's her integrity. Victoria Hayes could have taken the easy path, accepted acquisition offers worth billions, and retired to count her money. Instead, she's continued to innovate, to push boundaries, to use technology as a force for positive change in the world. Someone in the crowd began to clap, a slow recognition of the magnitude of what they were learning. Others joined in, the applause building until it filled the ballroom. I stood in the center of it all, feeling surreal and exposed, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Nathan Pierce pushed forward, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by eager attention. Victoria, I had no idea. When I spoke to your office about the hotel technology integration project, they said you were considering our proposal. I never imagined. He gestured helplessly at the opulent ballroom around us. I thought you were just another tech consultant. I remember our meeting, I said quietly. You pitched smart room technology and energy management systems. It was a solid proposal, though the implementation timeline was overly ambitious. His face reddened as he realized I'd been serving him appetizers earlier in the evening while he discussed golf handicaps with his friends. I should have recognized you. I apologize. You saw what you expected to see, I replied, not unkindly. Someone in a serving apron doesn't register as a CEO to most people. More guests were approaching now, their attitudes completely transformed. People who had looked through me earlier now wanted to shake my hand, share business cards, discuss partnership opportunities. The same faces that had treated me as invisible help were suddenly eager for my attention and approval. Mrs. Davidson, the Historical Society president, appeared at my elbow with an ingratiating smile. Victoria, dear, I had no idea about your success. We're always looking for prominent community members to serve on our board. Perhaps you'd consider lending your expertise to our restoration projects. Judge Morrison was right behind her. Ms. Hayes, I've been involved in several technology law cases recently. Your insights into AI development would be invaluable to our Judicial Education Committee. I looked at their expectant faces, these pillars of Cedar Falls society who had been content to ignore me completely when they thought I was merely hired help. The transformation in their behavior was as swift as it was transparent. Success commanded respect in a way that character apparently did not. I appreciate your interest, I said carefully, but I'll need to think about any additional commitments. My company requires most of my attention. Samantha finally reached the center of the commotion, her face flushed and her carefully styled hair beginning to come undone from her rush through the crowd. Victoria, what is happening? What are all these people talking about? I looked at my sister, this woman I had known my entire life, and realized she was asking about me the same way she might inquire about a stranger. They're talking about my work, Sam. The company I've built over the past 5 years. But you said you worked with computers, she said weakly. You never mentioned being a CEO or having billions of dollars or being on magazine covers. You never asked, I replied simply. When I tried to talk about Meridian, Mom called it my little business venture. When I mentioned speaking at conferences, Dad said I was wasting my education. Eventually, I stopped trying to share. The hurt in my voice was unmistakable, and several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Katherine Walsh was watching our family dynamic with the keen interest of someone witnessing a fascinating case study in human behavior. But why didn't you tell us how successful you were? Mom appeared beside Samantha, her voice carrying a note of accusation. Why let us think you were struggling with some startup company? Because you made it clear that what I was doing didn't matter to you, I said, feeling years of frustration finally finding voice. Because every time I tried to share my achievements, you changed the subject to Samantha's latest accomplishment or Dad's most recent case or Mom's charity work. Because you were embarrassed by my choices. The accusation hung in the air between us, raw and undeniable. Around us, 300 wedding guests were getting a front row seat to our family's dysfunction, watching years of miscommunication and willful blindness come to light in the most public way possible. Dylan stood beside his new wife, looking completely lost. I don't understand. If Victoria is really this successful, why was she serving food tonight? Why didn't anyone mention that she's some kind of technology mogul? Because they didn't know, Katherine said bluntly. Because this family has been so focused on their own definitions of success that they never bothered to recognize it when it was standing right in front of them. Her words stung because they were true. I watched my parents process the implications of what they were learning, saw the moment when pride began to compete with embarrassment in their expressions. Here was their daughter, achieved beyond their wildest dreams, and they had missed it completely. Victoria, Dad said, his voice carefully controlled, if this is all true, if you really have achieved this level of success, then we need to discuss why you felt the need to hide it from your family. I didn't hide anything, I said, my own voice rising slightly. I sent you articles about Meridian's funding rounds. I invited you to my keynote presentations. I tried to explain what we were building and why it mattered. You just weren't interested in listening. The accusation was direct and devastating. I saw Mom flinch as if I'd struck her, saw Dad's jaw tighten with the automatic defensiveness of someone who was beginning to realize they might be in the wrong. We thought you were being modest, Mom said weakly. We thought you were exaggerating your role in the company. You thought I was lying, I corrected. You thought I was making myself sound more important than I actually was because that was easier than accepting that I had succeeded in a way you didn't understand. The crowd around us was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word of our family confrontation. This was better than any television drama, a real-time revelation of secrets and resentments that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Katherine cleared her throat, drawing attention back to herself. If I may, she said, addressing the gathered crowd rather than just our family. What we're witnessing here is unfortunately not uncommon. Victoria Hayes has achieved something extraordinary, but because her success didn't fit traditional patterns, it was dismissed and undervalued by the people who should have celebrated it most. She turned to look directly at my parents. Your daughter didn't just build a company. She built a legacy. Her work in sustainable technology is literally changing how businesses around the world think about their environmental impact. She's creating solutions to problems that will affect your grandchildren and their children after them. The weight of her words settled over the ballroom like a heavy blanket. My parents were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had missed, the significance of achievements they had spent years minimizing and ignoring. Moreover, Katherine continued, she did it with integrity. In an industry known for cutting corners and prioritizing profit over principle, Victoria Hayes has maintained ethical standards that have become a model for other companies. She's not just successful financially, she's successful morally. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness but from the relief of finally being seen and understood by someone who comprehended the full scope of what I had been trying to accomplish. For years, I had carried the weight of my family's indifference, wondering if perhaps they were right to dismiss my work as unimportant. The tragedy, Katherine said, her voice softening as she looked at Samantha, is that this revelation is happening at a wedding instead of around a family dinner table. It's happening in front of 300 strangers instead of in the privacy of people who love each other. Samantha's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. Victoria, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought you were just helping out because you wanted to be useful. I was helping out because you asked me to, I said gently. Because you're my sister and I love you, even when you don't understand me. The simple statement of love seemed to break something open in the tension that had been building. Samantha stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, wedding dress and all, holding on tight as if she could somehow make up for years of misunderstanding with a single embrace. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry I didn't see you." Over her head, I met my parents' eyes. They looked older somehow, as if the revelation of their daughter's success had aged them in real time. There was shame there, and regret, but also something that might have been the beginning of pride. The crowd around us began to disperse gradually, sensing that the public portion of our family drama was coming to an end. People returned to their tables, their conversations now animated with discussion of what they had just witnessed. The wedding reception would continue, but it would be forever marked by the moment when the serving girl revealed herself to be an industry titan. Katherine lingered, her expression thoughtful as she watched our family try to navigate this new understanding of itself. "Victoria," she said quietly, "I hope this conversation continues in private. Your family clearly has a lot to learn about the woman you've become." I nodded, still holding Samantha close. "We'll figure it out." "I'm sure you will," Katherine said with a smile. "After all, if you can build a billion-dollar company from scratch, family communication should be relatively simple." As she walked away, I realized that everything had changed in the span of a single conversation. The carefully maintained fiction of my professional mediocrity had been shattered beyond repair. There would be no going back to being the family disappointment, no more serving food while others celebrated their own achievements. For better or worse, I was finally visible. The immediate aftermath of Katherine's revelation created a strange bubble of suspended time around our family. Guests had returned to their tables, but I could feel their attention like a weight pressing against my shoulders. Every conversation seemed to include glances in our direction, and I caught fragments of whispered discussions about net worth, magazine covers, and the incredible woman they had completely overlooked. Dad stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture I recognized from childhood as his thinking stance. His political training was warring with his parental confusion, trying to process how he should handle a situation that had no precedent in his experience. "Victoria," he said finally, his voice carefully measured, "I think we need to have a private conversation about this situation." "Situation?" I repeated, feeling a familiar spark of irritation ignite in my chest. "Is that what we're calling my professional success now? A situation that needs to be managed?" Mom stepped closer, her social instincts fully engaged despite the shocking circumstances. "Darling, please keep your voice down. People are watching." Her eyes swept the ballroom, cataloging which guests were paying attention and calculating the potential social ramifications of our very public family revelation. "Let them watch," I said, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. For once in my life, let them actually see me instead of looking right through me. The words came out louder than I intended, carrying clearly across the nearby tables. Several conversations paused mid-sentence, and I felt the familiar heat of embarrassment begin to rise in my cheeks. But underneath the embarrassment was something else, something I hadn't felt in years when dealing with my family: power. Victoria Hayes. Judge Morrison materialized beside us, his presence commanding immediate attention. "I owe you an apology. I had no idea I was in the presence of such a distinguished entrepreneur this evening." His tone was respectful in a way that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier when I was merely the bride's sister helping with catering. "No apology necessary, Your Honor," I replied, falling automatically into the professional courtesy that had become second nature in business settings. "You had no reason to recognize me out of context." "Nevertheless," he continued, "I wonder if you might consider speaking to our Judicial Technology Committee. We're implementing new case management systems, and your expertise in AI integration could be invaluable." Dad's eyebrows rose as he processed the judge's deferential tone. Robert Hayes was accustomed to being the most important person in any room, the successful attorney whose opinions carried weight and whose approval was sought by others. Watching a respected judge treat his daughter with such obvious respect was clearly recalibrating his understanding of the social dynamics at play. "I'll have my assistant send you some information about our public sector initiatives," I told Judge Morrison. "We've developed several systems specifically for government applications that might be relevant to your needs." As the judge moved away, clearly pleased with the interaction, I turned back to my family. The distance between us felt wider somehow, as if Catherine's revelation had opened a chasm that couldn't be easily bridged. Samantha was still close enough to touch, but Mom and Dad had unconsciously stepped back, creating physical space that mirrored their emotional confusion. "Your assistant," Mom repeated quietly. "You have an assistant?" "I have several assistants," I said. "Along with a staff of over 2,000 employees across our facilities in Colorado, California, and our new development center in Austin." The numbers seemed to physically stagger her. Mom's hand went to her throat, fingering the pearls she always wore to formal events. 2,000 employees, she whispered. "Victoria, how did we not know this?" "Because you never asked," I said, and this time I didn't try to keep the hurt out of my voice. "Because every time I tried to share what I was building, you changed the subject or made it clear that my work wasn't as important as Dad's cases or Samantha's achievements." Dylan cleared his throat awkwardly. "I hate to interrupt, but maybe this conversation would be better suited for somewhere more private? This is supposed to be our wedding reception." His words hung in the air like an accusation. Here I was, disrupting my sister's perfect day with revelations that should have been handled years ago in the privacy of family dinners and holiday gatherings. The guilt was immediate and familiar, the same guilt I'd felt countless times when my presence seemed to complicate their carefully ordered world. "You're absolutely right," I said, starting to turn away. "I should let you get back to your celebration." "No." Samantha's voice cut through my retreat with surprising firmness. "Dylan, this is important. This is my sister we're talking about." She looked around at our parents, at the guests still stealing glances in our direction, at the elaborate wedding reception that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the truth we were finally confronting. "Besides, this is exactly where this conversation should happen." "Samantha," Dad said in his warning tone, "this is neither the time nor the place for family drama." "Family drama?" The phrase hit me like a physical blow. "Is that what you call it when your daughter turns out to be more successful than you ever imagined?" "Family drama?" "That's not what I meant," Dad said quickly, but the damage was already done. The dismissiveness in his tone, the automatic impulse to minimize and contain, was exactly the pattern that had driven me to stop sharing my professional life with them in the first place. "Actually, it's exactly what you meant," I said, my voice gaining strength. "Because that's what you've always done when my choices didn't fit your expectations. When I dropped out of law school to start my company, it was dramatic. When I turned down the corporate law position you arranged, it was rebellious. When I moved to a smaller office instead of the prestigious downtown space you picked out, it was disappointing." Each accusation landed like a hammer blow. I watched my parents' faces as they processed the pattern I was describing, the years of subtle and not so subtle disapproval that had shaped our relationship. "We were trying to protect you," Mom said weakly. "Technology companies fail all the time. We didn't want you to get hurt." "So you protected me by assuming I would fail?" I asked. "By treating my work like a hobby instead of a career? By making it clear that nothing I accomplished would ever measure up to your standards?" The ballroom had gone remarkably quiet around us. Even the band seemed to sense the weight of the conversation unfolding and had shifted to softer, background music that wouldn't compete with our voices. 300 guests were getting a masterclass in family dysfunction, watching years of resentment and misunderstanding play out in real time. Katherine Walsh reappeared at the edge of our circle, her champagne glass replaced and her composure fully restored. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, though her expression suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, and I feel compelled to add some context." She turned to address my parents directly, her professional authority making her words carry extra weight. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, I don't think you understand the magnitude of what your daughter has accomplished. Victoria hasn't just started a successful company. She's revolutionized an entire industry." Dad straightened, his competitive instincts engaging. "I'm sure Victoria has done well for herself, but let's maintain some perspective here." "Perspective?" Catherine's eyebrows rose. "Very well. Let's discuss perspective." She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Victoria's company went public 18 months ago. The initial public offering was oversubscribed by 400%. Her personal stake in the company is currently valued at approximately $3.7 billion. She looked up from her phone, meeting Dad's eyes directly. To put that in perspective, Mr. Hayes, your daughter is worth more than the GDP of some small countries. Her company employs more people than live in Cedar Falls. Her annual revenue exceeds the budget of the state of Colorado. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background conversations at nearby tables had stopped entirely, every ear in the ballroom straining to hear Catherine's devastating recitation of my achievements. Furthermore, Katherine continued, clearly warming to her subject, Victoria has been profiled in every major business publication in the country. She's been invited to speak at the World Economic Forum, consulted with the United Nations on Sustainable Development Goals, and advised 3 different presidential administrations on technology policy. I felt a strange detachment as I listened to Katherine catalog my accomplishments. It was surreal to hear my professional life summarized so clinically, especially in front of the family members who had never shown any interest in the details of what I did for a living. But perhaps most importantly, Katherine said, her voice softening slightly, Victoria has maintained her integrity throughout her success. In an industry known for ethical compromises and profit-at-any-cost mentalities, she has consistently chosen the harder path of responsible innovation. Her company's environmental standards have become the gold standard for the tech industry. She turned to look at me, her expression mixing admiration with something that might have been protective anger. This is a woman who could buy and sell half the people in this room, who commands more respect in boardrooms than most politicians do in Congress, who has built something that will outlast all of us. She looked back at my parents. And you had her serving appetizers. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I watched my parents process not just the scope of my success, but the optics of how they had treated me. The image of their billionaire daughter wearing a borrowed apron while serving hors d'oeuvres to guests was going to haunt them for years. We didn't know, Mom said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't want to know, I corrected. There's a difference. The distinction was important, and I could see that it registered with everyone present. Ignorance could be forgiven, but willful blindness was a choice that carried consequences. Nathan Pierce, who had been hovering at the edge of our conversation, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Victoria, I need to apologize publicly. When I pitched that hotel technology project to your company 6 months ago, I spoke to you with the respect your position deserved. Tonight, I treated you like invisible help. That's inexcusable. His admission opened the floodgates. Other guests began approaching, their faces showing various combinations of embarrassment, curiosity, and social calculation. People who had looked through me earlier were now eager to establish connections, to rewrite their interactions with me in light of new information about my status and wealth. Miss Hayes, Mrs. Davidson appeared with an ingratiating smile. I had no idea we were in the presence of such a distinguished entrepreneur. The Historical Society would be honored if you would consider joining our board of directors. Victoria, called out Dr. Peterson from across the room, my wife and I were just discussing your company's environmental initiatives. We'd love to have you speak at our sustainability conference next spring. The transformation was as swift as it was transparent. The same people who had been content to ignore me completely when they thought I was hired help were now competing for my attention and approval. Success commanded respect in a way that character apparently did not, a lesson that wasn't lost on anyone present. I looked around the circle of suddenly interested faces and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? Recognition from my family and their social circle. Acknowledgement of what I had built and achieved. But standing there in my bridesmaid dress, surrounded by people whose attention had been purchased by the revelation of my net worth, I realized that recognition without understanding felt hollow. These people still didn't see me, not really. They saw my bank account, my business empire, my professional accolades. But they didn't see the woman who had built those things, the choices I had made, the values that had guided my decisions. I appreciate your interest, I said carefully, addressing the group of eager faces around me. But I think tonight should remain focused on celebrating Samantha and Dylan's marriage. Several people looked disappointed, as if they had hoped to conduct business negotiations during the wedding reception. The social dynamics were fascinating and depressing in equal measure. My value as a person had changed completely in the span of 30 minutes, not because I had done anything different, but because information about my wealth had become public knowledge. Samantha moved closer to me, her wedding dress rustling as she navigated the crowd. "Victoria," she said quietly, "I'm starting to understand why you never told us how successful you were." I looked at her, my little sister who had somehow become a stranger over the years as our lives diverged down different paths. "Why's that?" "Because this," she gestured at the crowd of suddenly interested guests, "isn't about you at all. It's about what you can do for them." Her insight surprised me. Samantha had always been socially astute, able to read the undercurrents in any gathering. But I hadn't expected her to recognize the transactional nature of the attention I was suddenly receiving. "That's part of it," I agreed. "But it's also about something else." "What?" I looked around the ballroom, taking in the opulent decorations, the designer dresses, the careful social hierarchies that governed every interaction. "It's about the fact that none of you could imagine me being truly successful because it didn't fit your picture of who I was supposed to be." The observation hit home. I could see it in Dad's face, the way his jaw tightened as he processed the accusation. I could see it in Mom's expression, the defensive flutter around her eyes that appeared whenever she was confronted with uncomfortable truths about herself. "That's not fair," Dad said, but his protest lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I asked. "When was the last time any of you asked me about my work? Not just polite questions about how business was going, but real questions about what I was building and why it mattered?" The silence that greeted my question was answer enough. They couldn't remember because it had never happened. My professional life had been a closed book not because I had hidden it, but because they had never shown enough interest to ask me to open it. "We assumed you would tell us if something important happened," Mom said weakly. "I tried," I said. "I sent you the Forbes article. I invited you to my keynote at the tech conference. I mentioned the UN consulting work in the White House meetings. You treated all of it like background noise." Each example was a small wound reopened, a moment when I had reached out for recognition and received indifference in return. The accumulation of those moments over 5 years had taught me to stop trying, to keep my professional triumphs separate from my family relationships. Dylan, who had been standing quietly beside his new wife, finally spoke up. "Victoria, I need to ask you something directly." I turned to look at him, this man who was now technically my brother-in-law, who had known me for 3 years without ever really seeing me. "If you're really worth billions of dollars," he said, his voice carrying a note of accusation, "why did you let us think you were struggling financially? Why didn't you offer to help pay for the wedding?" The question was so tone-deaf, so completely missing the point of everything that had just been revealed, that I almost laughed. Instead, I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. "Because you never asked," I said quietly. "Because the one time I offered to contribute to family expenses, Dad told me to save my money for when my little computer company inevitably failed." Dad's face flushed red. "I never said that." "Christmas dinner 2 years ago," I said with the precision of someone who had replayed the conversation countless times. "You said startups were risky and I should be more conservative with my finances. You suggested I get a real job with benefits and save the entrepreneurship for when I was older and more established." The specific memory silenced him. I could see in his eyes that he remembered the conversation, remembered dismissing my company as a risky venture that would likely fail. At the time, Meridian had already been valued at over $1 billion, but he hadn't bothered to ask about the details of my business or its prospects. "But more importantly," I continued, "I didn't offer to pay for the wedding because that's not what family should be about. You shouldn't love me more because I have money, and you shouldn't have loved me less because you thought I didn't." The statement hung in the air between us, a challenge that cut to the heart of our relationship dynamics. Were they proud of me because of what I had accomplished, or because of how much it was worth? Would they have celebrated my achievements if they hadn't come with $1 billion valuation? Katherine, who had been watching our family drama unfold with the fascination of an anthropologist studying a rare social phenomenon, stepped forward once again. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms, I think this conversation illustrates something important about how we value achievement in our society. She turned to address the crowd that had gathered around us, many of whom were hanging on every word of our family's public reckoning. Victoria Hayes built something extraordinary not because she wanted to be rich, but because she wanted to solve problems that mattered. Her company's work in sustainable AI isn't just profitable, it's necessary for the future of our planet. She looked back at my parents. But because that work happened outside your direct observation, because it didn't follow traditional career paths, you dismissed it. You assumed that success had to look a certain way, come from certain types of companies, follow certain prescribed routes. Her words were a surgical dissection of the prejudices and assumptions that had shaped my family's response to my choices. The traditional markers of success, law degrees and prestigious firms and social recognition, had blinded them to the possibility that real achievement might take different forms. The tragedy, Katherine continued, isn't just that you missed your daughter's extraordinary accomplishments. It's that you taught her to hide them, to downplay them, to feel apologetic about success that should make any parent burst with pride. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness but from the relief of being understood and defended by someone who comprehended the full scope of what had been lost in the years of family misunderstanding. We made mistakes, Dad said finally, his voice heavy with reluctant admission. But Victoria could have been more clear about the extent of her success. Could I asked. Because every time I tried to share good news about my company, you found ways to diminish it. When we landed our first major contract, you said most startups fail within 5 years. When we announced our series of funding, you warned me about the dangers of owing money to investors. When we went public, you said the stock market was too volatile to count on. Each example was another small wound catalogued and preserved, another moment when enthusiasm had been met with caution and skepticism. The pattern was unmistakable once laid out in sequence. We were trying to protect you from disappointment, Mom said, but even she seemed to recognize how inadequate the explanation sounded. You were protecting yourselves from hope, I corrected. Because if you acknowledged how well I was doing, you'd have to admit that maybe my choices weren't as foolish as you thought. Maybe dropping out of law school wasn't a mistake. Maybe starting my own company wasn't naive. Maybe I knew what I was doing after all. The accusation cut deep, and I could see it register on both my parents' faces. They had invested years in a narrative where I was the family member who needed guidance, who made impractical choices, who required their wisdom and caution to keep me grounded. Admitting that I had been right all along would require them to reconsider not just their assessment of my judgment, but their entire understanding of our family dynamics. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities for connection. Around us, the wedding reception continued in a subdued fashion, guests stealing glances at our family confrontation while pretending to focus on their own conversations. Finally, Samantha stepped into the center of our circle. "Stop," she said, her voice carrying surprising authority. "Just stop, all of you." We turned to look at her, this bride who was supposed to be the center of attention on her wedding day but who had instead become witness to the unraveling of our family's carefully maintained illusions. "Victoria," she said, looking directly at me, "you're right. We failed you. We dismissed your work, we minimized your achievements, we made you feel like you had to hide your success from the people who should have been celebrating it." She turned to our parents. "And you're both wrong if you think this is about money or recognition or social status. This is about seeing Victoria for who she really is instead of who we thought she should be." Her words carried the weight of truth, cutting through the defensive explanations and hurt feelings to identify the core issue we were all dancing around. This wasn't about wealth or business success or professional recognition. It was about being seen and valued for our authentic selves rather than for how well we fit into other people's expectations. "But," Samantha continued, turning back to me, "you're wrong too if you think hiding your success was the answer. You taught us to underestimate you by underestimating yourself." The observation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. How much of my family's dismissiveness had I enabled by downplaying my achievements, by allowing their skepticism to go unchallenged, by choosing the path of least resistance over the harder work of demanding recognition? Maybe, I admitted quietly. But that doesn't excuse 5 years of willful blindness. "No," Samantha agreed. It doesn't excuse anything. But maybe it explains some things. She looked around at all of us, her family gathered in this moment of painful honesty in the middle of her wedding reception. The question is what we do now. Do we keep relitigating the past, or do we figure out how to move forward? Her question hung in the air between us, a challenge that required each of us to decide what mattered more, being right about the past or building something better for the future. The immediate aftermath of our public confrontation created ripple effects that spread far beyond our family circle. As the evening progressed, I watched the social dynamics of the wedding reception shift and realign like tectonic plates adjusting to an earthquake. Conversations at every table seemed to center around the revelation of my identity, and I could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes tracking my every movement. Judge Morrison approached me during the dessert course, his demeanor completely transformed from earlier in the evening. "Ms. Hayes, I hope you'll forgive my earlier oversight. I've been following Meridian's work in judicial AI applications with great interest. Your testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee was particularly insightful." The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 hours ago, this same man had looked through me as if I were invisible when I was serving appetizers. Now he was referencing my congressional testimony and using the respectful tone reserved for visiting dignitaries. The transformation was complete and deeply unsettling. "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied automatically, falling back into the professional courtesy that had become second nature in business settings. Our justice system applications are still in development, but early results suggest significant potential for improving case processing efficiency while maintaining human oversight. As he walked away, clearly pleased with our interaction, I noticed Dylan watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Throughout our 3-year acquaintance, he had always treated me as his future sister-in-law's slightly eccentric older sister, someone to be polite to but not particularly interesting. Now he was studying me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Victoria," he said, approaching hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. When Katherine first mentioned who you were, I thought there must be some mistake. I couldn't reconcile the woman serving food with the CEO she was describing." I set down my champagne glass and looked at him directly. "What exactly couldn't you reconcile?" The question caught him off guard. Well, you're so different from what I expected a tech CEO to be like." "Different how?" He shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing he was walking into dangerous territory. "More normal, I guess. Less intimidating. You help with dishes after family dinners and remember everyone's birthdays. You don't act like someone worth billions of dollars." His explanation revealed more about his assumptions than he probably intended. The idea that wealth and success should make someone less human, less connected to simple pleasures and family obligations, spoke to deeply ingrained beliefs about power and privilege. "What should I act like?" I asked, genuinely curious about his mental model of how successful people were supposed to behave. "I don't know," he admitted. "More demanding, maybe? More aware of your own importance? The billionaires you read about in magazines don't usually serve canapés at family weddings. Maybe that's because you've never been to a family wedding where a billionaire was serving canapés," I suggested. "Or maybe it's because the billionaires you read about in magazines understand something I'm still learning. Which is that success doesn't have to change who you are, but it definitely changes how other people see you." As if to illustrate my point, Mrs. Davidson appeared at my elbow with a bright smile that looked painted on. "Victoria, dear, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. The Historical Society would be honored to name you as our honorary chairwoman. Think of the doors that could open, the preservation projects we could fund with your connections." Her enthusiasm was transparent in its calculation. The same woman who had nodded politely at me during cocktail hour was now positioning herself as my best friend and closest collaborator. The speed of her transformation would have been amusing if it weren't so depressing. "I appreciate the offer," I replied carefully, "but I'll need to consider how it fits with my existing commitments." Of course," she gushed. "A woman of your stature must have countless demands on her time. Perhaps we could schedule a lunch meeting to discuss the possibilities." I watched her mental gears turning, already calculating the social capital she could gain from association with my newly revealed status. Every charity board and social organization in Cedar Falls would be competing for my attention now, not because of any particular passion I had shown for their causes, but because my name on their donor lists would open doors and attract other wealthy contributors. The pattern was repeating itself throughout the ballroom. People who had treated me as invisible background decoration 6 hours ago were now eager to establish connections, to find ways to benefit from proximity to my success. The transformation was so swift and so complete that it felt like watching actors drop one character and assume another mid-performance. Nathan Pierce approached during a lull in conversation, his earlier embarrassment replaced by obvious calculation. "Victoria, I've been thinking about our hotel technology proposal. Given what I now know about Meridian's capabilities, I wonder if we might expand the scope of our discussions. Perhaps we could explore a more comprehensive partnership." The proposal was exactly the kind of post-revelation opportunism I had been expecting. 6 months ago, he had pitched a modest technology upgrade for his hotel chain. Tonight, after learning about my net worth, he was suddenly interested in a comprehensive partnership. His business instincts were good, but his timing was appalling. "I think any business discussions should wait until after my sister's wedding," I said diplomatically. "This doesn't seem like the appropriate venue for contract negotiations." He looked disappointed but nodded acceptingly. "Of course, you're absolutely right. Perhaps my office could reach out to your team next week?" "My assistant will be in touch," I replied, falling back on the corporate deflection that had become automatic after years of managing unwanted business solicitations. As Nathan moved away, I noticed Samantha watching our interaction with troubled eyes. She approached slowly, her wedding dress requiring careful navigation through the crowd of guests. "This is what it's like for you all the time, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "People constantly wanting things from you. Never knowing if someone likes you for yourself or for what you can do for them." Her insight surprised me. Samantha had always been socially perceptive, but I hadn't expected her to grasp the isolation that came with visible success so quickly. "It's more complicated than that," I said. "Some people are genuinely interested in the work we're doing. Others see opportunities for mutually beneficial partnerships. But yes, there's always an element of calculation in business relationships." "That sounds lonely." I considered her observation, thinking about the careful distance I maintained from most professional contacts, the way I parsed every social interaction for hidden agendas and unstated expectations. "It can be," I admitted. "But it's also clarifying. You learn to value the relationships that exist independent of your professional identity." "Is that why you never told us about your success? Because you wanted to know if we loved you for yourself?" The question cut straight to a truth I had been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. How much of my secrecy had been about protecting my family's perception of me, and how much had been about testing whether their love was conditional on my achievements? "Maybe," I said quietly. "Or maybe I was just tired of being disappointed." Mom appeared beside us, her face showing the strain of the evening's revelations. "Victoria, your father and I have been talking. We think we should probably discuss this situation privately, as a family." The word "situation" rankled, but I recognized it as her way of trying to regain control over circumstances that had spiraled beyond her comfort zone. Margaret Hayes had spent decades managing her family's public image, and having our private dysfunction exposed at a social gathering was her worst nightmare made manifest. "What would you like to discuss?" I asked. "Well, for starters, how we move forward from here. What this means for our family relationships. How we handle the public aspects of your revelations." Her focus on management and damage control was entirely predictable, but it also highlighted how fundamentally she was missing the point of what had happened. This wasn't a crisis to be managed but an opportunity for genuine understanding that had been years in the making. "Mom," I said gently, "this isn't about public relations or family image management. This is about seeing each other clearly for the first time in years. I understand that, darling, but we also have practical considerations. Your father's practice, my charity work, Samantha's new marriage. People will have questions about why we weren't more involved in your business success." The admission was telling. Her immediate concern wasn't about our relationship or the missed opportunities for connection, but about how their ignorance of my achievements would reflect on their social standing. The possibility that they might be judged for not knowing about their own daughter's extraordinary success was apparently more worrying than the actual distance that ignorance had created between us. Let them have questions, I said. Maybe some honest answers would be good for everyone. Before Mom could respond, Katherine Walsh reappeared, her timing impeccable as always. I hope I'm not interrupting a private conversation, she said, though her expression suggested she hoped nothing of the sort. Not at all, Samantha replied before Mom could object. We were just discussing how to move forward as a family. Katherine nodded approvingly. That's wise. What happened here tonight will be talked about for months. The story of the billionaire CEO serving appetizers at her sister's wedding is going to become legendary in certain circles. Her prediction sent a visible chill through Mom, who clearly hadn't considered the long-term social implications of our public confrontation. Surely people will be discreet, she said hopefully. Katherine's laugh was not unkind, but it was realistic. Mrs. Hayes, 300 people just witnessed one of the most dramatic reversals of social perception in recent memory. This story will be repeated at every country club, charity gala, and dinner party in Colorado for the next year. The scope of the social fallout was beginning to register on my parents' faces. Dad's political instincts were calculating the implications for his practice and his social standing. Mom was already mentally drafting explanations for her charity board meetings and bridge club gatherings. But, Katherine continued, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The story could just as easily be about a remarkable young woman whose achievements were overlooked by people who should have known better, but who maintained her humility and family loyalty despite their lack of recognition. Her reframing offered a path toward redemption, a way for my parents to transform their ignorance from a source of embarrassment into evidence of my admirable character. It was a generous interpretation that gave them an opportunity to save face while acknowledging their mistakes. That's one way to look at it, Dad said slowly, his lawyer's mind already working on how to present the narrative in the most favorable light. It's the accurate way to look at it, Katherine corrected firmly. Victoria could have used her wealth and influence to demand recognition years ago. She could have made her family's dismissiveness a source of public embarrassment. Instead, she continued to show up, to participate, to serve when asked. That speaks to character. I felt a complex mix of gratitude and discomfort at Katherine's defense. While I appreciated her support, part of me wondered if my willingness to hide my success had been more about conflict avoidance than noble character. How much of my discretion had been wisdom, and how much had been cowardice? The question now, Katherine continued, is what you all do with this information. Do you retreat into embarrassment and defensiveness, or do you use this as an opportunity to build something stronger? Her challenge hung in the air between us, a choice point that would determine whether tonight's revelations led to deeper understanding or deeper division. I could see my family members processing the implications, weighing their hurt pride against the possibility of genuine connection. Dylan, who had been listening to our conversation with growing understanding, stepped forward. If I may, he said, his voice carrying new respect, I'd like to say something as an outside perspective. We all turned to look at him, this man who had inadvertently catalyzed the evening's revelations by having a boss who recognized me from my professional life. Victoria, watching you tonight has been remarkable. Not because of your business success, but because of how you've handled this situation. You could have used Katherine's recognition as a weapon, as a way to shame your family for their assumptions. Instead, you've been patient and explanatory, even when you had every right to be angry. His observation surprised me. I hadn't felt particularly patient or generous during our confrontation. If anything, I had felt years of frustration finally finding voice. But, he continued, turning to my parents, I also think you need to understand what this looks like from the outside. When Katherine first recognized Victoria, my immediate thought wasn't about family dynamics or misunderstandings. It was about how a billionaire CEO ended up serving appetizers at a wedding. His bluntness made Mom flinch, but he pressed on. That image is going to stick with people, not because it's scandalous, but because it's so unusual. Successful people generally don't put themselves in service positions, especially not at family events where they should be honored guests. We didn't know, Dad said defensively, but Dylan shook his head. That's exactly the point. How do you not know that your daughter is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in America? How does that information never come up in family conversations? His questions were the ones everyone in the ballroom was thinking but too polite to voice directly. The fundamental mystery of how a family could be so completely unaware of one member's extraordinary achievements would fuel speculation and gossip for months. We thought she was being modest, Mom said weakly, but even she seemed to recognize how inadequate the explanation sounded. Modest about building a billion-dollar company? Dylan asked incredulously. About being featured on magazine covers and consulted by governments? There's modest, and then there's actively hiding information. His assessment was harsh but fair. The scale of my achievements made claims of modesty or family discretion seem implausible. The truth was more complicated and more uncomfortable. They hadn't known because they hadn't been curious enough to ask the right questions. Look, Dylan continued, his voice softening slightly, I'm not trying to shame anyone. But this situation is going to generate a lot of attention, and you need to be prepared for questions about family dynamics and communication patterns. He looked around at all of us, this outsider who had become an unwitting participant in our family drama. The good news is that the story doesn't have to be about dysfunction or failure. It can be about growth and understanding, about a family learning to see each other more clearly. His optimism was appealing, but I wondered if the damage was too extensive for simple narrative reconstruction. Years of misunderstanding and missed connections couldn't be erased by a single evening's worth of revelations, no matter how dramatic. What do you suggest? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective as someone without years of emotional investment in our family patterns. Honesty, he said simply. When people ask about tonight, and they will ask, tell them the truth. That you learned something important about each other, and that you're committed to doing better going forward. The advice was sound but challenging. Admitting to years of family miscommunication would require a level of public vulnerability that none of us were accustomed to. It would mean acknowledging mistakes, accepting responsibility, and committing to changes that wouldn't be easy to implement. And if people are critical? Mom asked, her social anxiety clearly engaged. Then they're critical, Dylan replied with a shrug. But most people understand family complications. What they won't understand is defensiveness or attempts to minimize what happened here tonight. As if summoned by our conversation, several more guests began approaching our group, their faces showing the curious blend of social calculation and genuine interest that characterized most networking attempts. Dr. Peterson from the Environmental Foundation arrived first, his wife trailing behind him with an eager expression. Victoria, I hope we might continue our earlier conversation about sustainability initiatives. Your company's carbon-neutral certification process could revolutionize how we approach environmental compliance. Behind them, the mayor's wife was waiting with obvious impatience, clearly preparing her own pitch for whatever civic cause she championed. Further back, I could see other guests positioning themselves for their turn at my attention, like courtiers waiting for audience with royalty. The queue of supplicants was both flattering and exhausting. These people weren't interested in me as a person. They were interested in what my resources and connections could do for their organizations and causes. The transformation in their behavior was so complete and so obviously transactional that it felt like watching a social experiment in real time. This is what your life is like, Samantha observed quietly, watching the gathering crowd with something approaching horror. Sometimes, I admitted. Though usually I have gatekeepers to manage the process more elegantly. How do you stand it? I considered her question, thinking about the careful boundaries I had learned to maintain between my public and private identities, the way I had trained myself to navigate relationships where my wealth and status always lurked in the background. You learn to appreciate the people who knew you before, I said. And you get very good at spotting genuine interest versus opportunism. Is that why you never told us? She asked. Because you were afraid we'd treat you differently? The question was perceptive and painful. How much of my secrecy had been about preserving the possibility of unconditional love, of relationships that existed independent of my professional achievements? Maybe, I said. Or maybe I was afraid you'd treat me exactly the same. The admission surprised both of us. I hadn't realized until I said it how much I had wanted my family to be impressed by my accomplishments, how much their continued indifference had stung even as I told myself I preferred their ignorance to their potential opportunism. That's even sadder, Samantha said softly. She was right. The idea that I had hidden my success partly because I feared my family wouldn't care enough to change their behavior toward me revealed a depth of pessimism about our relationships that was depressing to contemplate. The crowd of waiting guests was growing restless, their polite patience wearing thin as they watched us continue our family conversation. I could see the social calculations happening in real time, people weighing the potential benefits of my attention against the social cost of appearing too eager or mercenary in their pursuit. We should probably continue this conversation later, I said, looking around at the assembled faces. Your guests deserve attention, and this isn't the time or place for extended family therapy. Samantha nodded reluctantly. But we will continue it. This conversation doesn't end here? No, I promised. This conversation doesn't end here. As I turned to acknowledge the waiting crowd, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the ballroom's mirrors. The woman looking back at me was still wearing the burgundy bridesmaid dress, still had her hair pulled back in the practical style I had adopted for serving duties. But something fundamental had shifted in her posture, in the way she held herself. For the first time in years, I looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms and corner offices, someone whose opinions carried weight and whose decisions moved markets. The serving apron was gone, but more importantly, the apologetic stance I had carried in my family's presence had been shed as well. Tonight had changed everything. The careful fiction of my professional mediocrity had been destroyed beyond repair, and with it, the comfortable family dynamics that had allowed everyone to maintain their preferred narratives about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The question now was what we would build in place of those comfortable fictions. Whether the truth about my success would bring us closer together or drive us further apart remained to be seen, but one thing was certain, there would be no going back to the willful ignorance that had characterized our relationships for the past 5 years. 5 years later, I walked through the doors of the Cedar Falls Community Center, carrying a box of presentation materials for the monthly family communication workshop that had become one of our most requested programs. The same building where I had attended school board meetings as a teenager was now hosting sessions that brought together parents, adult children, and family counselors working to bridge professional understanding gaps. Tonight's group included 12 families from across Colorado, each dealing with their own version of the challenges we had navigated after that transformative wedding reception. The Martinezes were learning to support their daughter's decision to leave medical school for sustainable farming. The Johnsons were working through their frustration with their son's choice to become a professionally sports athlete. The Chens were trying to understand their daughter's nonprofit career after expecting her to join the family restaurant business. Welcome everyone, I said as participants settled into the circle of chairs we had arranged. Tonight we're focusing on practical strategies for supporting career choices that don't match your expectations or experience. The workshop format had evolved significantly from our early attempts at sharing our story. Instead of dramatic presentations about family revelations, we now facilitated interactive sessions where families practiced communication techniques, shared their own challenges, and learned from each other's successes and setbacks. Maria Martinez raised her hand tentatively. My daughter Sophia wants to start an organic farm instead of becoming a doctor like we planned. We invested so much in her education, and now she wants to grow vegetables. How do we support something that feels like she's throwing away her potential? The question captured the heart of what so many families struggled with, the difference between supporting a person and supporting their choices, between parental investment and individual autonomy, between family expectations and personal fulfillment. Let's explore that together, I replied, facilitating rather than lecturing. What does support mean to you, and what does it mean to Sophia? The conversation that followed revealed familiar patterns. Maria equated support with approval and financial wisdom. Sophia interpreted support as curiosity about her goals and respect for her decision-making process. The gap between those definitions had created months of family tension and mutual frustration. Sophia, I asked, turning to the young woman who had been quietly listening to her mother's concerns, what would it look like if your parents supported your farming goals without necessarily agreeing with your career change? I guess I'd want them to ask about my business plan instead of just telling me it's impractical, Sophia said thoughtfully. I'd want them to visit my internship site and see what sustainable agriculture actually involves. I'd want them to understand that this isn't a rejection of education, but a different application of learning. Her response highlighted a crucial distinction we had learned to make in our own family: the difference between supporting someone's choices and understanding their reasoning. Parents didn't need to agree with their children's career decisions, but they did need to demonstrate genuine curiosity about the values and goals driving those decisions. David Johnson shifted in his chair, preparing to share his own family's challenge. Our son Marcus makes more money playing video games professionally than I make as an accountant, but it doesn't feel like a real job to me. How do I respect something I don't understand? The question resonated throughout the group. Many parents struggled with career paths that hadn't existed when they were making their own professional choices, leaving them without frameworks for assessing success or providing meaningful guidance. David, what would you need to learn about Marcus's work to understand it as a legitimate career? I asked. I guess I'd need to understand the business side, he admitted. The contracts, the revenue streams, the career longevity planning. If I could see it as a business rather than just playing games, maybe I could respect it as work. His insight was exactly the kind of breakthrough that made these workshops worthwhile. When parents could translate their children's career choices into concepts they understood, they were much more likely to offer constructive support rather than skeptical resistance. The evening continued with role-playing exercises where family members practiced having curious conversations instead of judgmental ones, asking about goals instead of questioning decisions, and sharing concerns without demanding changes. The techniques were simple but required consistent practice to override years of established communication patterns. As the workshop concluded, participants exchanged contact information and committed to monthly check-ins about their progress with family communication. The ongoing support network had proven essential for sustaining changes beyond the initial workshop enthusiasm. Walking to my car afterward, I reflected on how dramatically my relationship with Cedar Falls had evolved. 5 years ago, I had been the invisible family member serving food while hiding my professional identity. Tonight, I had facilitated meaningful conversations that could improve family relationships for generations. The town square looked the same, but everything else had changed. The Family Professional Integration Institute now operated programs in 43 cities across North America. Our research had been published in major family therapy journals and incorporated into university curricula. The model we had developed from personal crisis had become a systematic approach to family career communication that thousands of families were using successfully. More importantly, our own family had continued evolving and growing together rather than apart. Dad's legal clinic had expanded to include policy advocacy for entrepreneurship support and small business protection. Mom's educational programs had influenced state legislation about adult workforce development and digital inclusion. Samantha and Dylan's consulting firm had become a leading voice in sustainable tourism policy across the Pacific region. But the most meaningful changes weren't professional accomplishments or program statistics. They were the small, ongoing practices of genuine curiosity and mutual support that had become natural parts of our family culture. Monthly professional meetings where we shared current challenges and celebrated recent achievements. Quarterly planning sessions where we looked for ways to coordinate our different work for greater collective impact. Annual retreats where we assessed our communication effectiveness and committed to continued growth. The transformation had required consistent effort and ongoing vulnerability, but it had also generated rewards that extended far beyond our immediate family relationships. Learning to see each other clearly had taught us to see other people more clearly as well. Practicing supportive communication at home had made us more effective collaborators in our professional work. Building authentic family relationships had provided a foundation of trust and understanding that strengthened everything else we tried to accomplish. My phone buzzed with a text from Katherine Walsh, who had remained a close friend and occasional collaborator. Saw the CNN feature about the Institute's expansion. Congratulations on 5 years of meaningful impact. Best champagne I ever dropped. Her message made me smile as I drove home through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls. The dramatic wedding reception that had started everything felt like it had happened to someone else, but the relationships we had built since then felt solid and authentic in ways that our previous family dynamics never had. The story that began with serving appetizers while hiding my identity had evolved into something I could never have imagined, a life where personal authenticity and family connection reinforced each other rather than competing for attention. Success no longer felt isolating because it was shared and celebrated rather than hidden and minimized. Achievement no longer created distance because it was understood and supported rather than questioned and dismissed. Pulling into my driveway, I noticed lights on in the home office where I would spend the evening reviewing applications for the Family Communication Fellowship program we were launching next year. The work continued, but it no longer felt like work in the traditional sense. It felt like the natural expression of values and relationships that had been tested, strengthened, and proven sustainable over time. The woman who had once felt invisible in her own family had discovered that true visibility came not from recognition or wealth, but from authentic connection and meaningful contribution to something larger than individual success. That discovery had changed everything, and it continued changing everything in ways that remained surprising and rewarding after 5 years of intentional growth and mutual support. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.